welcome everybody to a great luncheon and what I think is going to be a really interesting and certainly timely and relevant conversation about connected cars. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are at Global Automakers. You can see arrayed on the slide the collection of leading successful international car companies that make up our membership, companies like Toyota, who you'll hear from today, as well as Honda, Kia, Hyundai, others who are large international, really global players in the automotive space and certainly in the connected car space. In addition to that, we have a group of large supplier integrator members, companies like Denso, also represented here today, Bosch, Delphi. And those supplier integrators really sort of enable us to be conveners and leaders of this connected car conversation. In addition to that, you can see a collection of exclusive car companies like Maserati and McLaren, Ferrari, Aston Martin, who are also members of the organization. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of who we are, and again, maybe a little bit of a rationale for why we're so interested in this conversation. So let me talk a little bit about what we mean when we say connected cars. And I think if I asked everybody in this room, and certainly everybody on this panel, you might get different answers. For the purpose of this discussion today, when we say connected cars, we mean cars that communicate with one another, that talk to one another. Vehicle-to-vehicle communications, vehicle to infrastructure, that is kind of the space that we're talking about today. Connectivity in the sense of telematics is critically important. Connectivity in the sense of infotainment is critically important. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we're really talking about vehicle-to-vehicle communications and the various aspects of it, the societal benefits, the deployment, the technology behind it, and certainly the policy implications as we move from the laboratory onto the roadway, which is really, frankly, already happened. So a little bit more framing on this. I've been in the industry, as Melanie told you, for longer than I'd like to admit. And really, if you think about this from a safety perspective, the way to think about it is really we've been on this evolution. We used to talk about safety in the context of airbags and seat belts, so what we now call passive safety. And we've moved from passive safety to active safety, things like lane departure and crash avoidance braking and the like. And now we're moving from active to connected. The opportunity to really supercharge that active safety technology and add to it through connected cars, tremendous advancements with regard to crash avoidance and safety benefit. And we'll talk a little bit about, in this panel, about what those benefits are. Here's another way to look at it. This is how the DOT thinks about the benefits. So this is a number of applications. I'm certainly not going to read through it, and you can see it on the DOT website, but you can see benefits or applications of this technology that produce benefits arrayed in these three areas of saving lives, saving time, saving fuel. I guess the last thing I'd say before we get into the panel and I introduce the panelists is there's been a lot of work and a lot of excitement and a lot of activity in the space. Many of us were in Detroit 2 weeks ago for the ITS World Congress, the Intelligent Transport Systems World Congress. I see Paul Feenstra from ITS America here today. And what we saw was that this is indeed moved from the laboratory to the roadway rather, where you see test beds with 3,000 or so vehicles on the road, real roads today with this technology. So we're going to get into what this is about, what it means, how the technology works, and what the very near-term future looks like in this technology. And I fully expect, knowing many of you in the room, that there'll be lots of good questions, and we'll certainly entertain those. So let me get into it now without further interruption. To my immediate left, as you heard, is Ravi Shankar, who's the Executive Director and Lead Automotive Analyst at Morgan Stanley. He joined Morgan Stanley in 2004 and was promoted to Lead Analyst on North American Autos in 2009. And he is, by the way, the lead author of the 2013 Morgan Stanley Blue Paper, that discuss the future of autonomous vehicles, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in the space to take a look at that research. It's outstanding work. And to Ravi's left is Mohammed Jawed, who is the Global Key Account Director at NXP Semiconductors. He's had over 20 years of international and U.S. experience in automotive engineering and enterprise sales for large-scale deployments of audio and automotive technology. He's been with NXP for over 15 years. And prior to that, he and I shared not exactly space, but some time together at Ford Motor Company. To Mohammed's left is Doug Patton, who's Executive Vice President and Engineering Division at Denso International America. He oversees the operation of development facilities, testing, technical services, engineering administration, and the company's product engineering. And Doug has been with Denso for 28 years, I think. Is that right, Doug? And he was previously an engineer and senior market analyst at Caterpillar. And then again, last but not least is Kevin Rowe, who's Director of Technical and Regulatory Affairs and Safety at Toyota Motor North America. And Kevin joined Toyota in 1997 and has over 20 years of experience in the automotive industry. He's responsible for government safety, rulemaking activities, and company initiatives on ITS. So as you can see, we have an absolutely outstanding panel that will give you a broad variation of perspective on this issue. And so let me start with Ravi, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give just a couple of minutes of framing from their perspective, and then I may ask a question or two along the way, and we'll get right into it. So, Ravi?
Thanks, John, and many thanks to Global Automakers and the WAPA for having us here today. So we at Morgan Stanley Research have been working on the topic of connected cars and autonomous cars in depth for about 18 to 24 months now. And I'd say there's been a pretty meaningful shift in the investor perception on this topic. I'd say even about 12 months ago, we couldn't bring up the topic of connected and autonomous cars without some level of sneering and eye-rolling among the investment community. You know, what the hell are you talking about? I wouldn't say there's been a seismic shift or 180-degree change in that, but people are definitely more accepting of the technology today. We still hear the most common pushbacks around liability and regulation. Some people, I had one person last week tell me I don't want the NSA driving my car. But beyond that, you know, the most common feedback we get is, yes, the technology is real, but it's so far out, you know, does it really matter in our investment time horizon? I think that's a very interesting approach because we don't think it's really that far out, and B, we think the adoption can actually be accelerated once you consider the benefits of having these cars on the roads. Now, it's pretty easy to come up with the practical implications of having a car that can drive itself. Obviously, increased mobility for the very young, the very old. Accidents, crashes, and deaths will significantly reduce. You can now go have as many beers as you want at the bar without having to be concerned about getting home. But we at Morgan Stanley went one step further and tried to come up with the economic implications of these practical benefits. And honestly, we were pretty shocked by the numbers. What we came up with is if every car on the road in the US went fully autonomous and connected, we think we can save $1.3 trillion a year in the US alone. For those keeping count, that's 8% of US GDP and I think 150% of our defense budget or something. So the way we get there is about $500 billion comes from accident avoidance. We kill about 32,000 people on the roads in the US every year. Millions more are injured. Just the savings from not killing that many people, just using math that the EPA and the DOT have come up with adds up to about $500 billion. Another $500 billion comes from productivity gains. US kind of commuters spend between 75 to 100 billion hours a year in their cars. If they could work for even 30% of the time and could be productive, that's $500 billion. And about $300 billion comes from fuel efficiency gains, both from actual gas savings as well as congestion savings. An interesting test for you, if any of you on your way home today just drive a certain part of your usual drive manually and then switch to cruise control. It's empirically proven that with cruise control, your fuel efficiency improves by 15 to 30%. And autonomous connected cars on cruise control 100% of the time. So you'll see significant fuel efficiency gains from there as well. So $1.3 trillion savings from potentially getting the stuff on the road. We think that not only prevents regulation from coming in the way of getting these cars on the road, actually accelerates adoption because those are huge savings. And the global number is about $5 trillion a year. And before I pass it on, the beauty here is that it's not switch on, switch off. That is, you don't go from 0 to 1.3 trillion. It's going to be an adoption curve. We think between now and when the first fully autonomous cars hit the road by the end of the decade, you'll see a gradual increase in the level of autonomous capability. And the dollar benefits are also going to follow that ramp. I mean, if you have a car that's 50% autonomous capable, you'll get 50% of the economic benefits. So we think, the dollar cost savings alone are something that makes it necessary to have V2V and autonomous cars on the road as soon as possible.
Ravi, before we hand it off to Mohammed, let me just, you mentioned regulation. Let me just make a point and then ask you a follow-up question about it. Another, of course, important recent development is that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has begun the process toward a rulemaking that would require the enabling technology for vehicle-to-vehicle communications. And so they've gone through this process, and they've identified this as a safety benefit. And they've focused on the requirement for actually, they've taken a path toward the establishment of a crash avoidance safety regulation. When we look at this process, NHTSA would appear to be creating an environment that will enable innovation beyond simply crash avoidance. Is that how investors see it? Do they see this as an environment for innovation, or do they see this as simply another crash avoidance safety regulation?
No, the investors who can think that far see this as massively disruptive, as we see it as well. And obviously, we'll get thoughts from experts in the auto industry here. But once we move towards a connected and autonomous world, the car as we know it is going to change. I mean, if the driver doesn't drive, do they care what kind of powertrain goes in the car? Do you even need a steering wheel? Do you need lights? There are many fundamental questions about the car that need to be answered. And so from an investment perspective, the car goes from being primarily a hardware device to being predominantly a software device, because you're going to need an electronic brain driving the car. That's a complete shift in the way the auto industry thinks, because they know how to beat metal into shape. They don't know how to write code at this point. I mean, companies like Denso and other suppliers in the industry are leading that charge. So investors will have to think about what companies are investable and what are not. And the other amazing aspect here is that this doesn't just touch the auto industry. It touches a number of adjacent industries. Freight transportation. Telecom networks. I mean, you're going to need networks by the side of the road. Every road needs to be telecom connected. The medical industry. The insurance industry. They're going to see significant seismic shift, massive disruption from this opportunity. So again, there are many investors who think out 10, 15 years, and there are very few opportunities like this out there. It comes once in a generation.
Thank you, Ravi. So now just to shift gears from the sort of the broader dimensioning of the benefits and the societal view, let's get into the technology a little bit. So Mohammed, from NXP, you're a semiconductor company. So tell us how you see this connected car environment and the V2V environment developing, and what's the opportunity there?
So yeah, the perspective, at least I bring to you over here, is now at the, let's say, the guts of the system. And I think there was a...
oh, I'm sorry. Pass this to...
there we go.
There we go.
Just had a few slides to share, give you some perspective. So from an NXP perspective, we play in several spaces out there, from the consumer arena and the automotive arena, the identification arenas. And what we're talking about here specifically in automotive has some very unique challenges, and it's inherent to things like requirements. It's yes, quality, reliability are important in other arenas, but in automotive, it's absolutely critical. The other aspect we have to look at over here is the longevity of the solutions. So whenever we have these new technologies come into place, the challenge that semiconductor guys face is, I'll just speak a little louder. The challenge that the semi guys have is trying to develop these solutions so that we have flexibility in place and can also predict how the solution is going to migrate over the years. Don't forget, we're sporting cars that get built in 3 years or launch in 3 years, have another 10 years of life, and then have to be serviced for another 10 years after that. And so that poses some unique challenges for a semiconductor guy. So important to NXP then is the trends in automotive. And so when we look at ITS and the macro trends, the mega trends in the automotive space, things like energy efficiency are important. We have the safety, the security aspects of solutions that continue to advance and shape this space. And from a ITS application standpoint, it's a very solid fit in these arenas. So I talk about connectivity as well as a trend. You see today the consumer market crashing into the automotive space. That also poses itself some challenges. What is connectivity? And inherent to NXP, we are dealing with all aspects of connectivity. So via the vehicle, the modules within the vehicle talking to each other via the vehicle network, you coming in with your phone and pairing into the vehicle, transferring content into the infotainment space connecting to the outside world, your key being secure. All of those aspects are thought of as connectivity in today's world. But to what was said earlier, we are talking about a far different arena here in ITS. So it's vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to infrastructure communication. So last couple of weeks ago at ITS World Congress, you saw quite a few demonstrations and some pretty significant participation. I think just about everyone was there, trying to show different aspects and trying to get some education out there that guys, the technology is out there. We were there in full force showing our solutions out there that, yes, we can meet the quality reliability requirements, but also there's a plethora of use cases out there that can bring benefit to the society. And so when we look specifically at ITS and the trends around ITS, from a semiconductor perspective, it's already now maturing to the point where, yeah, the solutions are ready. They're ready to be designed in and developed by the tier ones and adopted by the OEMs. But we're now focusing, we're now already looking at what's the next generation. So yeah, one aspect of it is the link quality. We're not talking about a Wi-Fi system sitting at your home and you've got a few connections in there sharing some content. We're talking about safety critical systems over here that have to have some long range communication capability, have to be able to look around corners, have to be able to look around the big truck that's driving in front of you on a 2-lane road and you're thinking about making a pass. That aspect is absolutely critical in terms of the connectivity and the quality of the data that's going back and forth. We, of course, have to focus on the security aspect of it. So with bringing a Wi-Fi system now into a vehicle, yeah, you have much, let's say, much more visibility of the system in the vehicle itself. And so security is a key topic today. Earlier at CES in January of this year, I think it was the #1 topic when we talked about ITS. So everyone now is thinking about, okay, how are we sure that we are secure and secure from a hacking perspective, for example, securing content that I have in there, for example, privacy aspect as well. And then in automotive, I mean, obviously we have to make these things cost effective to have the technology out there and adoptable to the public. Safety sells. There's no question that we bring safety out there to the consumer. They're going to be excited about it, but we also have to make it cost effective. So this technology already with one of our partners is already on the 5th generation. So where the initial solutions were discrete type implementations, maybe the size of a brick, we're now down to smaller than half of a credit card with some of these modules that you can now design in. So in a nutshell, I guess the message to everyone here is that the technology is moving along pretty well, ready to go. And right now, what we're excited to come out in about 2 years of mass production with some of the recent announcements that have been made out there. And with that, that's a little background about the semiconductor guys.
Great. Mohammed, thank you very much. Before we go to Doug, just you mentioned the phrase safety critical. You talked about security. The vehicle-to-vehicle communications are going to travel over the radio spectrum, correct? So how should we think about that? How important is the availability of the radio spectrum free of interference to safety-critical automotive systems, in your view?
Yeah, so in the U.S. over here, we're talking about using the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum, and there's a lot of discussions about sharing that spectrum. From an automotive perspective and applications, you're dealing with a safety-critical system, and you're looking at potentially bringing in now non-safety consumer-type applications into that space. I think that from a semiconductor perspective and a technical perspective, we try to stay neutral to that, to try to be able to make sure we are authenticating the correct messages and so forth. But when you start dealing with safety in an automotive space, it's far different than, you know, whether my phone works or, you know, I'm able to download this thing pretty quick. You know, you are going to be processing a lot of information in a very short period of time, making a decision on whether you're going to stop the car, veer it, and so forth. And for that reason, I think right now, if you ask me for my opinion, I think we have to be very cautious with how we proceed and make sure we've got things figured out pretty well in that spectrum. First, focus on the safety aspect. Let's get a good, clear understanding of how we're moving forward, and before we open it up to other areas.
Thank you, Mohammed. Doug, could you share some perspective from Denso's point of view?
Sure. Yeah, okay. First, I just want to put, I don't know how many of you have heard of Denso. We may be one of the best kept automotive secrets. Okay, Denso's about a $38 billion company. We deal with all the OEMs globally. So we're a very large company, and as the slide shows, we deal in very many different areas. And I think, especially in this, that's really important, because if you look at, this is what Ravi talked about, this is this whole space here, okay? This is everything from dealing with the driver and the information to the driver all the way out to satellite connection. So just to give you some perspective of the size of this, okay? So we want to talk about the V2X activity right now. And you know, so we've been involved in V2X for a long time. We've been involved with CAMP, which has been a government-funded organization with a consortium with CAMP, Crash Avoidance Metrics and Performance. Right. So there's been a lot of OEMs, and some have come and gone, and a lot of suppliers. I think one of the important pieces to this, though, is that we have to all do this. It needs everybody involved in this. It needs the semiconductor guys. It needs the component guys. It needs the vehicle guys. It needs the infrastructure guys. You know, it's a bigger picture than just one place, right? And simply, what does it do? What's the most value of it? You know, it provides non-line of sight information. You know, whether it's the car stopping ahead around the turn, whether it's in a traffic, in a city in a traffic signal. I mean, it's really, really important communication between each car as to what's happening ahead of you that you really can't see. And that's something that no other technology can provide you today, right? I mean, we talk about radar and cameras and all these other technologies, and they're wonderful as long as you can see. But if you're not in line of sight, it doesn't help you. And so that's why this is so critical. That's why this is so important, and why we have to do this. Now, I thought somebody would surely ask this question. You can see a lot of different data like this. This just says, what does it take to be effective in the marketplace, right? This says it takes about 10% penetration. And you can argue about, okay, well, how long does that take? But the point is, even at a very relatively small penetration in the marketplace, you can start getting value. To Ravi's point about where does the value start? It starts pretty quickly, all right? So we got to think about that, and we've got to think about how we can adopt at a most quick rate. Now, I knew everybody would love this chart because they would try to read this and try to understand what this was, right? So I tried to make it a little bit easier. This is what Denso's been involved in as part of the camp activities. And if you look at this, you can see the first one is very simple, right? It's how we went from a router to putting it in a vehicle, right? So very simple. And then how do you make a unit to put it in the vehicle with, right? And then how do you make two cars talk to each other by doing that? So sort of simple. And then how do you make sure everybody's car or everybody's chips or everybody's things talk to one another? That's the next thing we've been involved with. And then how do we make a bunch of them work together, right? So you can read this chart if you're interested of all the details, but just to give you some perspective of this has been in the past 10 years of how we've brought this along from its infancy to where it is today. And then, of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar, if you're familiar with this topic, about the field test that's going on in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There are several thousand vehicles being tested live. So this is technology that is available, is happening, is helping today. It's not autonomous drive. I would like to challenge that into the decade comment. But it's not autonomous drive that's somewhere out there. It's happening now. And I think I got to stress the fact that it takes everybody to do this. I started with this, but we all have to be engaged in doing this. Just having one of us, two of us, three of us doesn't work. And then just as a small commercial, each one of you guys talked about little different aspects. At ITS World Congress, we had 3 different demos, okay? One demo was a breadcrumb follow. Breadcrumb follow means we followed the track that the vehicle went in front of us. Not the vehicle, but the track it left through DSRC. Now, what's the application for that? I think you mentioned, John, about having a drink one night and being able to go home. So you call your cab, you just hook it up you hook it up with the DSRC and the car follows you home. I don't know, maybe that's possible. And the other one we did was an HMI demonstration, which showed the kinds of interfaces that the cell phone, somebody mentioned about a bicycle demonstration. We were talking about that at another demonstration. But those kinds of identifying what's going on around you using this information. And the third thing, a little bit different than this conversation, but we did a platooning operation on two semi vehicles. And this is not just with DSRC, but DSRC is an important part of that with radar, LiDAR sensors, and with some other intelligence involved in this. But this is how it can be a real business model for the transportation industry to reduce cost. There's been some tests on that, data collected on that, and says that you can reduce about 7.5% fuel economy on a semi. And that's where the bulk of the transportation cost comes, is the fuel economy. So this is back to Ravi's point about where are there benefits to doing this. So there are a lot of different benefits, and they're happening now. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm not going to change it.
Doug, that's terrific. You mentioned everybody. It's going to take. It's not just 1 or 2 or 3, but it's everybody. And I'm sure there'll be more on this for all of you to opine on. But is there a role for government as well? And if there is, what is that role? Is it simply NHTSA establishing a regulation? Is it making sure the radio spectrum is free of interference? Is it all of the above? How should policymakers and those of our colleagues in the room who are thinking about the intersection of vehicle technology and public policy, how should they be thinking about this?
That's a little tough question for an engineer, but there are a couple of pieces to that. I think from the spectrum side of the equation, all right, the slide I showed you was from a house router to in the vehicle, right? How many people, what do the commercials say on TV? If your bandwidth, if you got too many people on your line, it gets clogged up. So what's going to happen in automotive if we share that bandwidth with something else? I mean, this is a safety device. It's going to provide us some other economic benefits, but it's first and foremost a safety device. I think we have to make sure that we can protect the spectrum until we're very comfortable that there aren't any issues with having 3,000, 10,000 cars pinging off of one another.
Doug, thank you. Now we're going to move to the, as Doug described, the OEM part of the world, so Toyota. Kevin, talk about this technology from Toyota's perspective and how you see the marketplace developing and the role you're playing.
Sure. Thank you, John. From Toyota's perspective, we've really seen V2V as kind of part of the evolutionary process of safety technologies. 20 years ago, when I started working in the industry, the big issue back then was airbags. Airbags was the big safety item. Crashworthiness was the big hot issue. We talked about a lot of areas and protecting the occupants once you are in a crash. Over the years, that's started evolving into crash avoidance. Now that the crashworthiness technologies have really advanced, and I think as Ravi mentioned, got about maybe 32,000 fatalities a year now, which is a huge decrease over the years. Crash avoidance technologies have emerged, and we're trying to come up with ways to try to avoid the crashes altogether. Now, where V2V comes into place is to try to extend that even further. So imagine that you've got a circle around you of protection from your radar, your LiDAR. V2V can go even further beyond that. So you're going to have information from vehicles that are coming around a blind turn or a blind intersection, vehicles that are blocked by other large vehicles on the highway. One analogy I have is when I was in Japan. In Japan, we have some vehicle to infrastructure technology. I was on the highway as a passenger in the vehicle, and it's a little unnerving because I was actually they drive on the other side, so I'm on the left-hand side of the vehicle, and there was a vehicle merging from a left-hand flyover ramp that was coming overhead, and the vehicle had a warning inside for the driver to let him know there's this vehicle that's going to be merging from your left-hand side. And you can't see that because it's a flyover ramp. That type of technology is what V2V is going to be able to do. You're going to be able to identify vehicles out there or potential hazards out there that otherwise your radar system may not be able to accomplish. So it's this other whole cushion of protection around you to warn you of what's potentially out there. For Toyota, we've been involved in the CAM project that Doug had mentioned, and been involved in the whole model deployment with the DOT and appreciate DOT's leadership. We also support the rulemaking that NHTSA is going through. We think you may actually, as reporters, find that a little odd to hear the industry talk about a regulation that we're supporting over all the history of us seemingly opposing a lot of regulations. But in this case, it's a real good opportunity for us to see this technology, see it advancing, and if we have a regulation that's going to provide the basic framework to ensure that a Toyota vehicle can communicate with a Ford vehicle, GM vehicle, et cetera, then we're all going to have the right pieces in place so that all the vehicles are going to be able to talk with one another. And the important thing to understand is with that model deployment and with the work that is going on in Europe and in Japan, this technology really is ready today. All we really need is the right framework in place in order for all the manufacturers to know that this has a green light, that we've got the ability to make sure that cars can communicate with one another, that we don't have a spectrum issue out there that's still unclear, and also to address some of the security issues that I think Mohammed had mentioned. So for Toyota's perspective, we really see this as a technology that's ready and can be on the road for all the safety benefits that Ravi had mentioned, in addition to the mobility and fuel economy benefits. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. So you mentioned it's here and ready to go. Can you, perhaps without divulging any particular corporate secrets, can you give us some sort of sense of when can consumers expect to see connected vehicles on the road? And we heard Doug say 10% is sort of the critical mass. I mean, is it Does this deploy only through new vehicles, or is there, I know you're concerned primarily with new vehicles, but how do we get to that 10%? And when do we think it happens?
Yeah, I can't say exactly when that's going to happen, but some of the key steps in order for that to happen is for the NHTSA rule to come out and have a better, clearer picture of what the basic requirements are going to be, and then to also have the spectrum issue cleared up and security issue cleared up for the industry. Some of the technology may start coming out early. You've already heard an announcement from General Motors. I'm sure other automakers are going to start making announcements. But I think that to reach that 10% and start working towards a larger fleet deployment is going to be based upon those three critical factors. It's going to be the NHTSA rule, the spectrum issue, and security issue.
Thank you, Kevin. Before we open it up to questions, just one follow-up question on that. Maybe Doug, you can give us some perspective on this. Can we expect this getting to that critical mass or this deployment to also happen in the aftermarket? In other words, will there be the opportunity for consumers to buy devices outside the vehicle and bring them in? Is that part of the equation here in your view?
I think the aftermarket has to be a piece of the equation. The NHTSA rules, of course, to outline the basic requirements for that are the first step to doing that. But to provide that information to everybody, not just the select few who buy a new vehicle, I think it would be extremely valuable from an economic standpoint. And from a product standpoint, that's relatively easy to do. I think we need to have some kind of decisions about how we're going to communicate that information. So there's a couple different levels that you might want to do that. But I think aftermarket has to be a piece of this as we move forward.
Thank you. Let's open it up. I'm sure there are questions. If you could, as I point at you, stand up and maybe tell us who you are so that we know, since you know who we are, we can be responsive to your question. And so Melanie will help me manage the questions. Please.
Thank you. I'm Tom Goldberg with Lineage Technologies. And excellent presentation. Very, very much appreciated. And congratulations to you all. This is the right direction to go, especially for people my age. Early in my career, I did something called Lifetime Driver Learning Initiative with Penn State, and Congress was really wise enough to kill our program. But in any case, with that as kind of a framework, I just came over here from the software assurance and IT supply chain security meeting that is a DHS, DoD, GSA forum. And I just would like to invite you guys to participate. There's a lot going on there that is impacting you, and you may not be aware of it. The other thing I would like you guys to participate in is the NIST working groups on cyber-physical, because they've got you in their crosshairs, and you need to be there. Because I think all of the safety issues, all of the impact on our lives and our health is vital. And I think economically you hit the right points, Mr. Shankar. I think that's a very defensible position, but there are an awful lot of undercurrents elsewhere that need your participation. And thank you.
It's a great comment. Anybody want to respond or add to build on that?
I'd
Doug?
like to say something about the safety issue. About everybody talks about cybersecurity, but there are some fundamental things that are going on in the automotive business called functional safety, ISO 26262, if anybody's familiar with that. And basically it says there has to be a fail-safe capability in the system. And if you think about that as the first step, that goes a long way in security of the vehicle. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of levels of the security thing to think about. And the automotive business is already moving in their direction. That's already a planned activity. It's already in process, and we continue to move forward with that. There are other levels that we have to go to, that there's other things we need to do, but we recognize that safety is the key factor.
Kevin, do you want to build on the cybersecurity aspect of Doug's comments?
Sure. I think from the industry perspective, I mean, each company is looking at the issue on its own for its own technologies. At the same time, the industry is coming together, working with within global automakers and the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, trying to develop a industry, an ISAC, an Information Sharing Analysis Center, and it's going to be an ISAC similar to maybe what you've heard of with other industries, where we can share information about cyber attacks with our vehicles with one another in an environment that allows for that type of sharing, so that everyone's going to have an understanding of where these attacks are coming from and have some familiarity with it. We're hoping that that's going to be able to come together. We're going to have doing a lot of work within the industry and the member companies in that area, and also keeping NHTSA abreast of what our progress is.
Great. Other question? Yes.
Les Jackson, Cruise Control Radio and Media. I know some of you don't necessarily agree with Ravi's timeline. I happen to agree with you, and I hope it comes true. But my question is, for all of you, Ravi in particular, I'll just address you. As these vehicles phase in, autonomous or semi-autonomous, do you see the first ones being vehicles that will say just memorize the routes you give them and they'll drive you back, and not necessarily be completely autonomous, not necessarily be connected to all other vehicles? Or do you see the full boat just happening? And maybe, you know, each auto company is not about to tell us what that's going to be, but I just envision your personal car, the passenger side mirror, I think says, caution, the future is closer than you think.
Sure. Look, I think the first thing the industry needs to do is probably just come up with a definition of what it means to be autonomous, because everyone defines it in a different way. When we talk about autonomous, we're talking about a car being able to drive itself without human input in at least 95% of traffic situations. We don't directly get to that point. I think we already have basic ADAS, which is advanced driver assistance systems, like John said, lane departure, blind spot, adaptive cruise control. Those are all mainstream technologies in cars today. That is a very basic level of autonomous driving already. I think you'll see a gradual increase in the capability. The Mercedes-Benz S-Class, I'm sure a few of you in the audience have one of those, that just went on sale a few months ago, can already drive itself in traffic jams and on the highway. There will be cars launched in 2016 that can park themselves. So you show up at a mall, you get off the car, you go in, you press a button or key fob, the car goes off, finds a spot and parks itself. So you'll see increasing level of capabilities. And I think that's very important, because if you have always manually driven your car, you're going to be very uncomfortable getting into a car that doesn't have a steering wheel. You're like, what gives? I don't trust this thing. But once you've experienced adaptive cruise control, like I have ACC in my car, the first time I tried it, I was convinced I was going to die. By the fifth time when I was still alive, I'm like, hey, you know what? This thing really works. And now if I get into a car that doesn't have it and I get on the highway, I have to recalibrate the way I drive, because I'm so used to having ACC on my car. So as you have that increasing level of capability, I think you'll have people getting comfortable with it. So it won't be just a straight jump. I think it'll be a curve.
So let me just, before we let the rest of the panel get into this, is a great question. How do we unpack the notion or understand the relationship between automated or autonomous driving, as we're discussing it, and the vehicle-to-vehicle technology that we're talking about today, right? How do the two things, is vehicle-to-vehicle technology an enabler of automation? Does it extend and expand? And how should we think about V2V in the context of that continuum you described and the continuum that Kevin described?
Sure. These guys are the experts in the technology, but from my understanding, you don't technically need V2V to have autonomous, but the likelihood of making an autonomous car successful goes up exponentially by having V2V. Okay, I think if you have a car that can talk to another car, look, autonomous cars work using a combination of cameras and radar and LiDAR and GPS. Those are the inputs of the car. They don't always work. For example, in thick fog, in snow, in rain, your input methods may not work, and that's where V2V really comes in and helps solve some of those issues. Another question we get asked about very frequently is, how can you have autonomous cars sharing the road with manually driven cars, right? Because you can have the guy who's texting next to you crash into a car that's driving itself, and it's that guy's fault, but the automatic car is probably going to get blamed for it. So in this case, again, V2V communication really steps in. And that's why we think it's absolutely essential to get this on the road as quick as possible. It doesn't matter if the car is semi-autonomous, fully autonomous, or manually driven. Again, if something happens and if autonomous cars just never happen, having manually driven cars with V2V communication also is a huge benefit.
Mohammed, why don't we go down the line on this question?
I think I want to go just back to the question itself about the timing. You're going to have a large opinion one way or the other. More 10 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 20 years. But I think part of that comes into, if you look back at the traditional automotive space, a highly mechanical world, to what it is now. From a semiconductor guy, it's a very exciting space to be in. I mean, the automotive guys, with regards to electronics now, are at the forefront in innovation. I mean, you look at CES, the automotive guys are there showing innovation in electronics. And so a lot of these features now, the automotive space is let's say, embracing them and trying to figure out how to bring it out there. The question on time, I think what helps out in this case is that there is a clear mandate of what is it that we need out there. And that solves a lot of issues with how do we make sure that systems work together and so forth. So I think it's almost a chicken and egg kind of thing there. Yeah, the technology's there, we can come out with it, but how do you bring it out right in a short period of time where society can benefit from it? And to what Ravi said, yeah, there's instantly a benefit whether you can take current radar-based systems and extend their vision of sight around corners and with trucks in front of you. So that step already is a huge step forward.
Doug?
Well, there's no doubt that V2X is an enabler to safety technology. And I think you have to go back to think about the driver's experience. I have ACC also, and I'm not so happy when those guys cut in on me because I leave that extra space in front of the car, okay? So that, as a driver, I'm not happy about that. So, what is a driver not going to be happy, or what is V2X going to help him? I would contend that V2X, because it provides you this non-line of sight, can provide you another level of comfort. I'm not talking about the kind of air conditioning comfort. I'm talking about the feeling of comfort, because you have some additional information, additional capability in the vehicle. And that's a driver acceptance piece of this, which sort of isn't really part of this discussion, but you have to think about that. That's another value added to the equation also.
Kevin?
I think for your question of V2V and autonomous vehicles, in our view, really V2V is going to be complementary to autonomous technology. It's going to really enhance it, especially with a mixed fleet of vehicles, have a better understanding of what's around you, and maybe similar to what Doug said, it's going to provide you with that additional layer of information that your vehicle with just the radar around it is not going to pick up. So with that additional information, your vehicle could potentially make better decisions on how to get through the highway. With respect to when autonomous vehicles may be here, I think in the industry, everyone's got a different opinion of when that's going to occur, and I think it all depends upon that curve as technology progresses. How much are people willing to accept, and how much are they learning along that curve of as we go from automated technology to autonomous? And as we build upon that, what are people accepting, what are they not accepting? And I think one of the big questions is, how do you provide for an autonomous vehicle that changeover from the automated performance realm back to a manual control realm? And in what cases, how do you alert the driver? That's some of the biggest research that's going on out there in terms of human factors and driver alertness.
Just one last sort of comment on that. I noticed that both Doug and Kevin used the term comfort. I think I saw in the work that supports NHTSA's rulemaking process that their view is that, did I get this right, that 80% of non-impaired highway incidents could be addressed by full deployment of V2V? I think that was the fact that I saw come out of that. So that's sort of a fact, a data indication of what that comfort means. Can we go to this gentleman here? I'm sorry.
Damola Idowu, Owners Illustrated Magazine. Now, my question is more about infrastructure and deployment. What kind of cost would it cost for the infrastructure as far as the V2X part and the V2V? Because already, for example, in Daimler C-Class, you have a lot of the autonomous technology in the C and the S-Class already available in the C, which is at a 40,000 price point. And with General Motors, you have cars in the 15 to 16,000 that already have in-car connectivity. So, I mean, as far as the hotspots, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, radar. So from a conductor part of it, how much would it cost to start deploying this and rolling this out? Because some of the bare bones of this technology already exist, but what would be necessary to add on and build upon? And from OEM part of it, like how do you see that affecting the final price point for consumers, which would be a big part in whether or not they think this is valuable to test something new and also have to pay extra for it?
Kevin, do you want to give it? You want to
Sure.
get started with that, Kevin?
I think, from the point of your question, you talked about the existing technology on our vehicles. We would have to actually use, we're talking about 5.9 frequency, which is different than where your Bluetooth and current Wi-Fi is operating. So we'd have to install a different radio in your vehicle to be able to communicate. But with that, again, maybe going back to the NHTSA rule, having more of these technologies, more of this technology required on vehicles is going to help really reduce the cost across the board, because you're going to have more and more of these on products, and as we get more of them on our vehicles, it's going to help reduce each OEM's cost and eventually the cost to the consumer as well.
I want to come to Doug in a second about that because you probably have some perspective on that, the device itself. But the question I think that is raised here is, or at least that I'm hearing you raise is that in addition to the cost of the device, it's the cost of the device for what benefit, right? And so, I mean, Ravi, again, back to your work, right? So we should look at this question broadly, right? About not only what the cost of the device is and the deployment of the technology is, but what's the value we're getting for that cost. Is that a fair? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think if you put, it's an interesting question. If you put a box in a car that can talk to another car, I think it may be a little hard to convince the customer, hey, your car can talk to the other car and so it won't crash, right? So they'd be like, fine, I get that, but I'm already paying so much for active safety and passive safety. Do I need this other extra box? I think an interesting, different approach would be like one that Tesla Motors is taking. Like Tesla Motors really has come in and reinvented the way they think about the automobile, and they're like almost, the rest of the auto industry kind of learning from them. And one of the things that Tesla has done is they put in more hardware content in the car than is actually necessary. So they put in a chip in the car that actually has 20% more processing capability than the car actually needs when it's shipped from the factory, because they keep putting in extra processing and over-the-air updates that uses that extra buffer. So our view, and I'd love to hear Kevin's view on this, is the automakers maybe just say, you know what, it's a $100 box, we're going to eat the cost, we're not even going to tell the customer that he's got this on his car, because 5 years from now, we'll activate the thing, and suddenly the cars are going to get much safer. I think that may be actually a different way than to convince the customer, pay me $100 for this box.
I think maybe just to add, because you also came at the question from an infrastructure standpoint, and there's a lot of, at the surface, you can think about, my gosh, how many traffic lights we have and so forth, how much is this going to cost us to implement? But there's also some smart approaches to think about, and I'll relate this to the Detroit area, the mixing bowl. It's an area where we have two highways coming together and three major roads, and there's always an accident there. If you install, for example, a DSRC modem over there, and you also have a car-to-car communication system, in place already, that becomes a much easier area to navigate. For example, it's an area which has, I think it's one of the top spots in the Detroit area for accidents. So, implementing it or rolling it out in a smart way also already sees benefits of the masses.
Doug, we're hearing terms, I want to make sure we're all level set. We're hearing about a box. We're hearing DSRC. We're hearing put the box in the vehicle, maybe it's aftermarket. Can you give us a little bit of V2V 101 here for those of us who may not be as up to speed as our panelists and others? I mean, what are we talking about here? What is this thing and what is DSRC?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, the router in your home, it's very similar to the router in your home. So it's that kind of radio technology, okay? Different frequency, which is, we talked about the bandwidth and what we need to protect. But it's that basic frequency as one piece of this box, if you will. The other piece of the box is the information, the information transfer. The radio's sending the signals, okay, and collecting, but then the box is also processing the signal, and meaning it's taking the data, it's reading the information that comes in, and then it's making some decision as to what to tell you. Is it telling you that there's a car on your right, or that the car's coming in over your head and you need to be prepared for it? It'll provide you different kinds of messages from that. And that's part of the NHTSA's activity, is identifying those messages. So they're standard. So Kevin talked about working with all the other vehicle manufacturers. All of these have to work together. So that's part of doing that. So all of these pieces, they're pieces that maybe you've seen before in different areas, now coming together in a box, if you will.
Other questions?
Yeah, we have 3 questions. We've got one this table, that table, in the back, and we can come back to you.
Hi, Eric Tegler with Wired. 3 questions. I'll make them as compact as possible. First, if V2V works, what does it do for automotive product differentiation? Does it aid that, or does it diminish that? Second, what if I, as an individual, choose to opt out of V2V? What are the costs for me personally from a regulatory standpoint? Third, why protect the spectrum for 5.9 for automobiles? It's also used by UAS, like the Global Hawk. There will be increasingly an Internet of Things that will use the same portion of the spectrum. Why do we allot this to automobiles?
Great questions. Who wants to start? Kevin, you want to get into a little? I mean, you can cover the automotive manufacturer OE aspect of that question. There's a lot in there, by the way.
Well, I'll take the last part of your last question first. The FCC in 1999 designated 75 megahertz of that frequency for automotive use. And in 2003, they came out with the rules governing the licensing, et cetera. Today, because of the whole spectrum issue, there is a drive to try to provide as much spectrum usage by unlicensed devices as possible. We as an auto industry, we're not saying that they're not allowed in our space. What we're saying is that provided there's no harmful interference, we have no problem with unlicensed devices in our space. And it really comes back to sharing, and what does sharing really mean? You know, this room is a shared room, but if there was another meeting going on in that corner while we're here in this corner, that really wouldn't work. But if there was some type of scheduling or understanding that certain meetings have priority or certain meetings are scheduled in, we can all share the space. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is some type of methodology in order for us and the unlicensed users or technologies to share that same space without any harmful interference to safety technologies.
What about the differentiation question? What about the notion of, does this enable, if I get this right, enable differentiation, product differentiation, I assume you mean? Does it increase? Exactly.
What has sold cars for over a
Correct. So
That's a really good question, and actually I'm going to tie that in with Ravi's question on the box, because really what the opportunity exists for automakers, and depend upon what strategy they take. Some automakers may just decide, look, we're going to do the bare minimum here, we're going to provide a box, they may have to eat the cost. Other automakers may look at the opportunity and say, okay, we're going to provide the minimum box here, but what other applications can we provide with that? It may be safety technologies, and maybe things other than safety-related technologies, other information systems that may be able to provide it to the driver, And that is, I think, the motive for automakers to help differentiate themselves and also help people to understand what they may be paying for.
But as
Doug?
you equip a car with increasingly sophisticated systems, who cares what the box I'm in is? It's about the interactive experience and about some other device mechanism either aiding my control or taking control. So who cares what the box is?
Right, but if this box we don't have to say box, but whatever this technology is going to be, right? But we're going to say an automaker is going to utilize that box that's provided for V2V.
And I think you have
That's
a very
going to
good
provide
point,
an
because
app.
if look, BMW today says it makes the ultimate driving machine, right? If you're going to be sitting in a car and not actually driving it, you don't care what the throttle response is and how quickly the transmission shifts and how easily it handles, because you don't care. You just want to watch Netflix on your windscreen. So it's going to be hard for the automakers, and I think that's why certain automakers today, like the Germans, like Toyota, like GM, that are working on this technology, again, when we talk to investors, they're like, who cares, this is 10 years out. But from an automaker perspective, 10 years is one engineering cycle. So they're working on this today because 10 years out, if, say, Volkswagen can launch a $30,000 self-driving Golf, and another automaker that competes with the Golf doesn't have it, it's game over for those guys, right? So I think initially it's going to be a game of survivors. People who don't have this technology 10 years out, those automakers are not going to exist. I mean, either they're not going to exist, or they're going to have to go to someone like a Denso and say, can I please put your autonomous driving system in my car? At that point, they do become like an HP or Dell, where they become a hardware, like low-cost hardware assembler, and these guys provide the brains of the car, right? So that's why, again, from an investment perspective, that's the big shift that we're all planning for. It's a good question.
Great, very good. Other?
Bob Weber, Chicago Tribune. How are we going to surmount the initial integration problems of a few V2V vehicles amongst a fleet of millions that don't have it? And what about the problems of non-connected entities, pedestrians, bicyclists, deer running out from the side of the road?
Well, should we ask our two camp members as they describe themselves? I mean, Doug, do you want to start with that at Denso?
It's interesting. I made the deer comment at lunch. You know, I don't think they're going to be wearing a little deer box, a little DSRC box around them. And that goes to the whole autonomous drive and what the capability needs to be at some point in the future. Actually, at the demonstration I mentioned at Belle Isle, Qualcomm is working on cell phone development with a DSRC chip in it, and we showed this in our demonstration, where if a pedestrian is coming up and if he's walking parallel with you with his phone in his pocket, you get no warning. If he's walking perpendicular to you, you get one warning. If he's walking perpendicular to you with his phone in his ear, you get another warning, because he's probably not paying attention to you if he's walking perpendicular to you with the phone in his hand. So I think those pieces are all there. There are other things that all have to happen, right? But this is a bigger ecosystem than just the car, okay? And if you think about it just as the car, maybe you have a good point, but I think it's much broader than that. As you know, Qualcomm is already interested and involved in this business. They've worked with several different people on these devices. So these kind of things are coming.
Can I just maybe relate this question to your 10%? How do those two things relate? So 10% is not 100%. So the gentleman asked the question, well, you have millions of unconnected cars. 10% doesn't seem like a lot. So how is 10% the critical mass? Why is that an important number for us to think about, or for you to think about?
The 10% number was somebody else's data that they collected. I'm sorry, I'm not the expert in that. And I went through about a dozen of those charts, and you know, that number varies depending on who you ask to do the study and what it looks like. I just picked one that was sort of simple to look at and understand quickly. But I mean, that's always the question, right? Is how many do you need to have to make it worthwhile? And if there's only 16,000 units out there that were produced in the first year, well, who's that going to help, right? And that's a challenge, all right? There's no way around that. Your aftermarket question, I think, relates to that. The infrastructure question relates to that. So the Qualcomm cell phone issue, all of these other pieces have to also come. That's, again, why it's a bigger ecosystem other than just the car.
Yeah, the way we think about it is that I think 93% of accidents are caused by human error, by some statistics. The sooner we get the human to stop driving the car, the safer it's going to be for all of us. Okay? So to your question of how do we integrate the cars with V2V, the cars without V2V, you get those cars either off the road or you put this system in the car as soon as possible. And that's why we think it's very important to get V2V in as soon as possible, because those cars are going to be statistically and actually safer.
There's another.
May I simply follow up? Where would we reach critical mass?
Yeah, so
How far out? How many years? How many vehicles? What percentage? Some kind of number.
So the 10%, just to what you were talking about, and this is an NXP perspective, so I'm not sure about the 10% that Doug's referring to. We were involved in trials, global trials, I mean, in Europe and in the US with Dodd in Ann Arbor and so forth. But with some of the studies that we've done, for example, in traffic congestion, with a 10% type of fit rate, you already see improvements in that. These were some European trials we've had. So what that opened our eyes up to is that, yeah, we're not talking about a 60, 70, 80% fit rate, for example, in that type of scenario. It can be as low as 10%, and you already see some benefit. Yeah, I think there's more studies that need to be out there, but when you look at some of the studies we've been involved in, yeah, it can be as low as that to already see benefit.
Is there another question out there? Maybe, I think we have time for, what, two more?
Two more. So a question here and here, and then if you guys
Great.
would like to
Perfect.
both afterwards, that'd be
Super.
John Fitzpatrick.
Please.
John Fitzpatrick with Stratacom. We're a strategic communications firm in DC and Detroit. My question goes to selling this to the public. I'm hearing a lot of terms of consumer acceptance, which to me is something to be tolerated. Robbie, you talked about the sneers that you got in the financial community. Obviously, the public has concerns. How do we get to widespread acceptance, but then push beyond that to getting to demand? I'm curious, whoever wants to take this, where do you think the public's head is today? They don't understand a fraction of this. And how do we get them to where we need them to be if, to Robbie's point, we're going to get this done quickly? There's a big gap to get there with the public still.
I think there's no other way to do it but to put a skeptical consumer behind the wheel of an autonomous car and let him text as much as he wants. And once people realize that they actually don't have to drive this thing and they can get from point A to point B with no input, I think, honestly, that'll blow their mind. Because I've been in these cars. I've been in a fully autonomous car on a highway. I've been, again, my car has some level of capability. The benefits here are very obvious and they're immediate. We think that connected cars and autonomous cars are a far greater and more tangible benefit than electric vehicles, which were, again, also sold as this big savior of the industry, but that never happened. We think this is a lot more real. And I think, once people experience it, I think they will come around, my view.
Kevin?
I think to address the connected vehicle V2V issue, I think there is some education that's got to take place. If you take a person off the street and talk about connected vehicles, they might think about Bluetooth or talk about satellite radio or what have you, or Safety Connect or OnStar. We really need to try to educate the consumer to understand what V2V is and what V2V can do for you. And I guess, as I mentioned before, we really see it as an evolutionary process. We see that it's really going to supplement the current crash avoidance technologies that are out there. And as people understand what those technologies do and the limitations, we can also point out that this is a supplement to that, and it's going to complement your technology really well.
Great. Last question.
Tom Crosby with AAA Carolina's Go Magazine. We know that everyone in this room probably speeds. 1/3 of all accidents are caused by speeding, and they contribute to the accident. What you're trying to sell the public is, I'm not going to speed. If I'm in a hurry to get somewhere, I'm going to have to use my V2. How am I going to go faster than you when I'm in a hurry and you're not? That's the human behavior side that I don't see the technology addressing. And of course, we all learn to drive, and as we decrease the experience of our behind-the-wheel behavior, what we do when we're behind the wheel, how is the override or the fail-safe going to deal with the person that doesn't have much driving experience versus the one that has? I think the same, Ravi just made the thing, electric cars, we were all over it. That was going to change the industry. Didn't happen because the public didn't accept it. And I think that, as you mentioned, I think that's the challenge with V2V too.
Maybe some perspective, being a father of a 16-year-old girl who thinks she's 23 and is ready to drive. That I had to quickly make a decision on what type of car I'm going to buy for her. And Dad, I like this Fusion, blah blah blah. And instantly I went to a 4x4. We live in Michigan. Made sure it wasn't too big, like an Expedition, but got her an Escape. And there's a lot of things that come into play in that decision making, and safety was number one, paramount for her. And I think clearly you're going to have the folks out there who love the car, want that big motor, want to drive out there. But I think in general, if you can tell folks we've made a safer car for you, you get acceptance. Safety sells in that world.
High-performance cars are selling like hotcakes.
Yeah, they sure are. And what in the end is a challenge. I mean, one thing we had a discussion about a little bit earlier is a little bit of, and I haven't heard anything about anybody bring that up, but it's the security of the information, my personal information. So I had a discussion with somebody, and I had the OnStar removed from the car before I bought it because I didn't want to have somebody watching over with me. But in the end, we've accepted the fact that we walk around with smartphones in our cars. That 22, 23, 25 parameters are measured and communicated all over the place. So, the public, I think awareness is an absolute critical part of this thing. And, a couple of weeks ago, as we said, with the ITS event in Detroit, it was, we really had spectacular participation from all arenas, not just automotive, but the media was there in force, trying to understand what is this thing that's coming out there.
Well, this is, we could go all day, I'm sure, but I want to thank our panelists, Ravi Shankar, Mohammed Jawad, Doug Patton, and Kevin Rowe for what I hope is an informative conversation.